Good morning and welcome to the Well Steps webinar. We have long been anticipating this webinar. There are over 650 people who registered for the webinar, and so we think that a lot of you have been looking forward to it too. It is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Steven Aldana, my business partner, my longtime friend. Most of you don't know this about Steve, but he wrote a dissertation on the return on investment, one of the first papers published in this field. He was practically weaned on this science. He knows this better than anyone that I know. There's absolutely no question about it. He is well known for publishing the definitive review on the ROI of wellness programs, which was published in the American Journal of Health Promotion. We've listed that on with the webinar materials for this webinar today. Steve is showing the new Well Steps webpage, and so he's going to show you how to get the slides and any other materials we talk about today. Just scroll down on our page, go to the Wellness Webinar button, and then you'll find it right there. Review of financial returns and some other stuff. There are their slides and etc. So we invite you to get the slides for this presentation. Many of you will be emailing or asking questions during the webinar, wanting to know where you can get them. That's where you get them. A couple of things you may not know about Steve. He's a proud grandpa. His grandkids are frequently over at his house. It is a jolly get together whenever you're there. There's kids and grandkids and all kinds of people over there visiting. He is one of the most avid bike riders I know, and he has an unblemished track record. He has never once wiped out on his bike. And I have ridden bikes with Steve, and so I find that very unbelievable because the first or second time I rode with him, I nearly wiped out. And he also is learning to play the ukulele. So stuff you didn't know about Steve, but now you do. We'd like to just thank Ryan Isaacson and other members of our team. Ryan Isaacson is on the back end. He will be manning questions for you. We'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar. All phones have been muted so that we can have a better webinar experience today. So you won't be able to verbally ask questions, but you can type them in on the GoToWebinar control panel, which should appear on the right side of your computer screen, and then we'll get to the questions at the end of the webinar. We'll save plenty of time for that. Again, the slides are available on our website. Just go to wellsteps.com, scroll down till you see the webinar circle, and click on that. You'll be able to find the webinar slides. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Steven Aldana, who's going to present the webinar today. Steve?
Thanks, Troy. I always mention when we do the webinars how honored I am that you will take some time to join us. We've had about 900 people click the link and almost 700 people register. So we know this is a hot topic, and I'm excited to do this because this is kind of my wheelhouse. It's been about 25 years since I did my dissertation. One of the very first times we really looked hard at an actuarial setting about what the return on investment is for wellness. And I'm excited to do this because I've been doing these studies since then. If there was an area of expertise that I feel particularly proud of and particularly adept at doing, this is the space. It's what I taught for years in academia. These are the research papers I've done. So I'm excited to help you answer really this question, and that is, are wellness programs a worthy investment? That's really the question. When we talk about ROI, when we talk about return on value, we're really asking the question, is this a wise place for my organization to spend some money? Will we get money back? Will this become a core business strategy, or will this be just kind of a flash in the pan? Is it worth my board's time, my time, our company's time and money? Because there is an investment required here. And is there a return? And how do we know that there's a return on that investment? That's what really the big question is. And everybody who has a wellness program asks the same question. The reason we're having this discussion today is because for about 20 years, we've pretty much had a free pass in the wellness world on discussing the pros and cons of our wellness benefits and what wellness programs can do. It hasn't been until the last couple of years we've had some very extreme vocal and violent critics attack the work that's been done. And what I find interesting is, I've spent my whole life working in this space, and now all of a sudden we have a lot of other people who pop up who know that all of this is right or wrong, and they've come in with guns blazing about all of this. It's like, where were you 20 years ago when we were talking about it? So what I want to share with you today is what do we really know to be true about the return on wellness programs? What do we know to be patently and blatantly false about that? How do you know the difference between a good program and a not so good program? And really, what are some valid criticisms of what we're trying to do? We're trying to answer this very question. So what's the best way for us to give you the best knowledge to go back to leadership or to go to your broker, your consultant, and say, is wellness going to be a worthy investment for us? Well, there has been some controversy that's come out in the last few years. Most of that controversy starts with what I call outrageous claims. Outrageous claims are statements that are so beyond compare and pale that they will catch your attention. If it's a bland, simple statement, you don't care much about it. But these are headline kinds of things. Here's a couple in the last couple of years that have come out that have gotten some considerable media attention. The iPhone uses more electricity than a refrigerator. And that's true if you stretch the iPhone out over about a 10-year period. It's just a ridiculous statement that catches your attention. We've had the whole social media and social contagion with risk and health risk. And so there is this statement, fat friends make you fat, which is patently false. It's simply not true. We know there are some associations there. So we get these really off-the-wall, outrageous claims. Well, there are outrageous claims being made by the critics about the wellness industry and about what's going on. And they are completely and patently false and outrageous. To help us understand these critics, I've turned to my good friend, Anton Ego. You remember the movie Ratatouille? Anton was the food critic. So Anton is our surrogate for our wellness critics. Yes, every single wellness outcome which has been made public is made up. That's a patently false, broad statement that the critics now promote with much gusto. Another one of my favorites. 90% of wellness programs being sold to companies are counterproductive at worst and worthless at best. So these are some catch-all, I'm going to throw out the kitchen sink and everything with it because all of this stuff is a completely made up garbage. So the first time I heard these quotes, I scratched my head and my first thought was, why would somebody say this? What would make them make those statements? And have they not read any of the literature or made up any of the information or ever published a paper in their lives about this? I've spent most of my career doing research and publishing papers on these wellness programs. And for someone to come out and say every single wellness outcome which has been made public is made up is just patently false. And I have a lot of other words to describe this. Some of them have to do with the digestive processes of cattle. But my point is, it's just garbage. It's just pure, unadulterated garbage. The problem is some people don't know the difference between garbage and fact, or fact and fiction. This has created some confusion in the market with some people. Those of us who've been in the wellness industry for our lifetime are appalled at the blatant nature of the patent lies about what we do. And we're appalled that people would not even look at the data carefully to see what we really do know. So when we talk about the return on wellness, I've listed a few things here that are known to be valuable components of the benefits of wellness. And there's a variety of them. What is the return of wellness? Well, it impacts a variety of these things. It impacts the medical cost spend for a company. These wellness programs can impact presenteeism and absenteeism. They can impact the prevalence and severity of workers' comp claims. They impact employee safety. There's long-term, short-term disability that are impacted by employee health. They have a dramatic impact on employee morale, and they can also be used for recruitment and retention. And so if you look at the entire scope, and this is not the full list, if you look at the entire scope, what we're really looking at is not just the wellness program itself, but we're looking at managing population health. When we manage the health and well-being of our employees, it affects each of these variables in this model. It touches these in some way. I can remember several years ago being at Microsoft and talking to their HR director, getting the tour of their wellness facility. They have one of the most extensive wellness programs and fitness centers I have ever seen at a corporation in my life, ever. It has few comparisons on the planet. There's no out-of-pocket expense for healthcare. There's zero copay, zero deductible. They have an amazing array of benefits. And the fitness facilities that they have were truly, truly world-class. They are used almost exclusively for retention and recruitment because they're competing with Google and everybody else for employees. They want to make sure there's a rich benefits package there. So their wellness, fitness, population health management efforts, their executive physicals, everything that they do is really focused on recruitment and retention. Now that's unrealistic for the rest of the world. We don't have those kinds of incomes and salaries and profit margins to be able to work, but they do. So they do it for different reasons, and you may be doing it for other reasons. In Europe or in the rest of the world where they have socialized medicine, they don't care so much about the medical cost side. They're really interested in presenteeism, productivity, safety, morale. They do wellness for a lot of other reasons besides healthcare costs. So when we look at the value of wellness and which of these is really meaningfully impacted by wellness, we have to ask ourselves, what evidence do we have to support this? If you're going to make a decision on whether or not wellness programs are worth it, if there is a return on investment, where do you get your information to make that conclusion? So this is the old standard knowledge chart. Where do we get knowledge? Well, we get it from personal experience. We can hear from peers or competitors or people that we know in the industry, our network. There are blogs and news articles and books. There's information that comes from wellness vendors. So you've got the producers of the world, the consultants and the brokers who know a little bit about this and sometimes a lot. Then you've got published science, research efforts, different types of studies that have been published looking at whether or not these programs can impact absenteeism or healthcare costs. You've got the critics who are out there lambasting the science or lambasting what they saying essentially whatever they want. And it's important to remember that everybody who is providing information, everybody on this list has an agenda, including WellSteps. WellSteps was originally designed to improve public health in a way that could be sustainable long term, which means we have to be able to make enough money to continue helping other work sites and employers improve public health. It's in our vested interest for our mission statement and for our profitability that we take a good look at this, and we have a way of approaching this. So whoever they are, I don't care what their purpose is, even the critics, everybody has an agenda. Absolutely everybody. Now, which of these would you rely upon the most? Which of these is the most unbiased and the clearest information that you can get? That would be the science. The science is the most trusted piece. A blog, say whatever you want in a blog, articles, books, nobody's going to look over your shoulder. You can say whoever, whatever, do whatever you want to do. But when we do science and we publish that science, all of a sudden the rules change. When we have a scientific paper that describes an outcome and an intervention and you used a methodology, that scientific review is looked at carefully by a set of peers. They're typically other professors, other experts in the world who are experts in that topic. They do this work for free. They review your study and they make comments. Well, did you do that? And what about this piece? And did you consider that limitation? And why didn't you not control for that piece? They're going to try to pick apart your study from a scientific perspective in an effort to make it better. They have to declare your conflict of interest when you do a paper. Do you have any conflicts? Is anybody paying you to do this? Generally, you declare your conflicts. And then you have to use scientific methodology that is valid. It means you're measuring, truly measuring what you think you're measuring. It's reliable. That thing continues to measure over time accurately, and that the entire study can be replicated by somebody else and get similar results. So, excuse me, these scientific papers are subject to careful scrutiny, and that's what sets them apart. It is the peer review process that allows other people to take a really deep dive and see what was done and to see how the study is weak, how it's strong, and it's as unbiased as we get. Sometimes they're still biased. And there is no such thing as a perfect study. Every single study ever done on anything on the planet published in any journal has some limitations. Even the best randomized clinical trials, which most people would consider to be the absolute gold standard. And you understand how this works. Groups are randomized, one group gets the intervention, the other group gets a control, and we follow them across time. So that at the end of the study, the only difference between the two groups is that one group got an intervention, the other group did not, all things being equal. That's the gold standard, and that's the way to go, if you can get there. But in most cases, especially in the business world, it is impossible or extremely difficult to ever do a randomized clinical trial. Now here's where this gets really muddy really quickly. Many people hold the randomized clinical trials as the only source of truth, light, and knowledge. In other words, if you don't have randomized clinical trials, you have no studies, you have no evidence, you have no proof. Do wellness programs work? Are they worth the investment? Well, let's take a look at the randomized clinical trials. Well, there's not a lot of them because they're extremely hard to do. So let me give you a scenario. We've done WellSteps in a variety of locations with a variety of employer groups in a variety of business sectors, so that they're all doing the same WellSteps program, but some are in Portland, Maine, some are in Illinois, some are in rural Iowa, some are working in sewage treatment plants in Nevada. These people are spread out across multiple states in multiple locations. They have nothing in common with each other than they're doing WellSteps campaigns and rewards and incentives. And then we track these people 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, and we see big improvements in health risks and improvements in elevated health risks, improvements in health behaviors. And you could ask the question, did you have a control group? No, we didn't. But we looked at multiple people in multiple locations in multiple time zones doing multiple jobs, and all of their results from these people ends up being the same. Well, you didn't do a randomized clinical trial. It's true. We did not have a control group because we couldn't find a group who agreed to do nothing for 3 years. So is that study any good? Well, you have to ask the question, what evidence what's the quality of that evidence? Well, in my book, that information across a whole bunch of different groups is just as valuable as a clinical trial. And let me give you an example. Take smoking. Take tobacco use. We know tobacco use is a problem. We know it's associated with multiple conditions, heart disease being number one, lung cancer. You get this. Do you know how many randomized clinical trials there are on humans who did and did not smoke in a control group? There are 0. There's not a single randomized clinical trial that has ever shown the ill effects of tobacco use. Not one. And the reason there's not one is because nobody wants to be assigned to the smoking group. Hey, come join our study. We'll give you some incentives and a little movie pass. You get to be assigned to the smoker group for the next 4 years. We want to see if it kills you or not. Nobody signs up for that study. So we have no randomized clinical trials for tobacco use, and yet we know from all the other studies, from all the other evidence, you shouldn't do this. It's clear, but there's no randomized clinical trials. So you could say, hey, wellness programs have very few randomized clinical trials, and it's true. Therefore, wellness programs don't do anything. That's the same logic applied to the tobacco industry. We have no randomized clinical trials. We also have no randomized clinical trials on the effectiveness of seatbelts, because nobody wants to be assigned to the don't wear your seatbelt group, the control group, and let's see what happens. So we don't have the study, and yet you all know, and there is lots of evidence, and it seems pretty clear that wearing seatbelts saves lives, even though there's no randomized clinical trials proving such. So this randomized clinical trial is a great way for critics to hide behind the science and say, wellness programs suck, you don't have any proof, you don't have any wellness, you don't have any clinical trials. Yeah, well, the same is true for tobacco, the same is true for seatbelts, and the same is true for whether or not organic foods are better than non-organic foods. There are no randomized clinical trials about the health benefits of organic foods, and yet it makes inherent sense that it would be better to eat foods that haven't been sprayed with herbicides and insecticides. So there's a limitation as to what you can hide behind when you use this information. So at the end of the day, companies, work sites, employers, they don't like to be randomized. We'd like you to do a big study. Dr. Aldan is here, and he wants to study the impact of your wellness program. In order to do a really good study, we need to randomly assign half of you to do nothing for the next 4 years. Nobody wants to sign up for that study. Not that it can't be done, it's just really hard. It's hard in the real world. It's easy with rats in a lab, but it's hard with real companies who are doing stuff and making it work. So we talk about wellness as one of those areas in businesses where we hold them to a very high standard. Wellness programs need to have lots of studies, and those studies have weaknesses, and there needs to be lots of clinical trials, and we need to really prove that wellness programs really change. We need to show all kinds of science behind that. And yet, I challenge you to think of any core business strategy that your company or worksite uses. Anything such as your marketing program, or your advertising budget, or product development, or maybe a new safety program. Maybe your own healthcare benefit and retirement benefits, whether or not your company has any financial consultants helping them guide you through retirement or budgeting, travel budgets. Name a single business strategy with more science behind it than wellness. I challenge anybody on our webinar today to give me any segment of any business that has more science behind it than wellness. Granted, we don't have thousands of randomized clinical trials, but we have thousands of other studies, just like the tobacco industry, just like the seatbelt science. We got lots and lots and lots of studies. What's curious to me is everybody comes out of the woodwork and everybody's up in arms about the ROI of wellness. But what's the ROI of your travel budget? What's the ROI of your healthcare plan? Did you ever think about your company offers a health insurance benefit? There's a huge cost to a company. Well, what's the return on that investment? What if you didn't offer a health insurance plan? What if you pushed everybody over into the exchanges and said, you're on your own, go find your own stuff? What would that do to the success or failure of your company? There's no studies looking at that. And yet we believe somehow that it's the right thing to do, and we do it. All I'm saying is, if you really want to be fair, you really want to get critical about wellness, and you really want to get all excited about the ROI of wellness, what about the ROI for everything else your company is doing? And for reasons I don't fully understand, wellness is held to a higher standard. For some reason, the critics say wellness is the one that has to really prove its value. Well, what about everything else? Why are we singled out? I'm not worried about it because the data is very compelling to support it. Let's just take a look at healthcare costs and how that works and how we can do an analysis. There are two real simple ways. Well, one simple way to take a look at the impact of wellness on your healthcare costs. One is just to evaluate the trends. What's happening with our healthcare spend across time? How does that compare to the rest of the companies that are carrier insurers? How does that compare to the region? How does that compare to other industries, other companies in our industry? How does that compare to the national averages? So you can do trend comparison. It's very simple. Any broker or any consultant worth their money can give you the data, and you can do some trend comparisons. That doesn't prove anything about your wellness program, but it does show that your costs are high or lower or equal to everybody else. Then there's another level of study to look at healthcare costs, and so these actuarial studies. This is the ROI studies that are there. Companies that embark on these studies need to be aware that you need to be careful what you're asking for. Dr. Aldana, we'd like you to help us analyze our healthcare costs from association with participation in our wellness program. Well, I can do that. We can look at every dollar that's been ever spent on every claim and every dollar ever spent on wellness. But you must be aware before we start that you may not like what we find. It's possible that your wellness program is associated with no change in cost. It's possible that your wellness program actually cost more in healthcare costs than when you didn't have a program. Hopefully, you'd like to say that your healthcare costs have gone down, but until you look at the study, the data are what the data are. A lot of weird things can happen, and I have seen every one of these three scenarios. I've seen it where healthcare costs go up. I've seen it where healthcare costs go down. I've seen it where healthcare costs show no change associated with wellness. Are you prepared to live under any one of those three scenarios? So let's just do a couple of examples. Here's a company, and this has been their healthcare trend spend per employee per year for about a 5-year period. And right about here is where your wellness program begins. So now we've got several years of good trend data. We kind of know where our costs are. And you look at your costs, and this is what happened after the wellness program began. Now here's where things get really interesting. If you look at that data and say, all right, well, before the wellness program began, the trend looked like that. That was kind of the trend. I mean, we can just see, if you were to guess in 2004 kind of where it was going to go, you'd be pretty accurate to say it's probably going to stay on that same trend. And yet it didn't, it deviated. And so the question then becomes, well, why? What made this cost take a different trajectory? Could it be the wellness program? Definitely. Could it be something else? Yes. In fact, there's a variety of reasons to explain that. Now, about this point in time, most people I talk to, their eyes start to glaze over and they start to get a little sleepy and they think, hey, that's great. And what they're really saying to me is, I really don't care. As long as my trend is good, I'm happy. And I don't want to dig in and find out why. But that's what we do in the science. We dig in and we try to find out why. What's caused that bend in the trend? Is it really wellness or is it something else? And this is where the waters get kind of muddy. So what we're trying to find out is, how confident are you that that new trend line, that new bend in the trend is due to your wellness program and something else? This is about confidence. This is a 50-50 chance when you flip the coin. How confident are you that you're going to get a heads or a tails? Well, you don't really know. So what caused the change in this plan design? What caused the change in this healthcare cost? This is getting to the core. Is my wellness program a wise investment? What evidence do we have? Well, it's possible that the wellness program caused the change in claims experience. In theory, people improve behaviors, they lower their health risks, they have fewer chronic diseases, they have lower utilization. That would explain that. But there are other things that could explain that as well. There are these high-cost cases, an employee who has a catastrophic injury or catastrophic illness, and we call these outliers, but they're exceptionally high-cost cases. To give you an example, here's the distribution of healthcare cost claims. Most people on the bottom down here, most people on this bottom line, most people, 24, 25, 23% of the population, they don't have any claims. I didn't go to the doctor once last year. A lot of people spend less than 500 to 1,000. This is per year. But there's this group up here at the very top that has way high expenses. This group of 3 or 4 or 5 people or percentage who have costs that are really high. Well, that's important. We call these the outliers. Some people call them the Pareto group, from the Italian mathematician. But this group can influence what happens. In the NBA, the National Basketball Association, the average salary for the players is $3.8 million. The median salary, that's the salary that's in the middle, the 50th percentile, is $2 million. And the reason there's a difference between the average and the median is because Kobe Bryant makes $30 million. He tilts the data towards the other end, which draws the average really high. Kobe, in this case, would be an outlier. He's ruining the trend for everybody else. By his very presence, it changes the average. So if you have this data set and your wellness program began, and all of a sudden you had fewer high-cost cases, you would end up with a trajectory that looks like that. It wasn't the wellness program. It was just dumb luck that you had fewer high-cost cases in your group, which makes it look like this. That's a possible explanation. But one way to do that is to analyze the data with and without high-cost cases. There are other reasons to explain why your program, why your trend is so good. Maybe you changed your plan design. Remember, if you change your deductibles, higher deductibles, people go to the doctor less. Higher copays, people go to the doctor less. High deductible plans, these CDHPs, people go to the doctor a lot less. In fact, the average is about an 18% reduction in costs associated with high deductible plans. That could explain it. A change in your workforce. Maybe you have a younger workforce than when you had in the beginning, because younger people don't go to the doctor as much as older people. Women go to the doctor more often than men. So maybe you have more men in the workforce. Maybe there are other things called historical effects. Like maybe there's something going on in your neighborhood or around your company that's caused people to be more aware of their health. Maybe there's a really good big push on the Biggest Loser program on TV and everybody's excited and they're all losing weight. That would be something going on outside of your workforce, like the Affordable Care Act, or maybe there were layoffs. Maybe you changed your third-party administrator for your company, or maybe you became self-funded. Maybe you have fewer employees and your total spend is obviously less. Maybe you don't have as many smokers as you once had at one time. And maybe there's this thing called regression to the mean, which basically says high scores tend to migrate down naturally, and low scores tend to migrate up. They tend to move towards the middle naturally. It's called, they regress to the mean. Somebody with a really, really high blood pressure, given enough time, that person's blood pressure is probably going to come down a little bit. Somebody with a really, really low blood pressure tends to kind of creep up a little bit. It regresses to the mean. That can explain part of this. So here's this situation again. I want to know why those costs are flat. And I want to know if it's the wellness program. So if you look at the entire workforce, everybody at this company, here's all the employees. The reason why the costs are flat is diluted in this group because you have some people who participated, some who didn't. It's a bit of a mess. You'd like to know if it was your wellness program, but you also know that not everybody participated in your wellness program. So one way we do this is we split the group out. So now, if it's the wellness program, let's find the people who were in the wellness program. And let's make a group. I know it's self-selection, but people self-select to be participants. And then there's a group that says, to heck with your wellness fluff, I'm not doing that. Okay, now let's evaluate these two groups independently to see if there's a difference. Because if there's a difference here, chances are pretty good it's more likely due to your wellness program. And this is what we did at Salt Lake County. They're self-funded, had about 3,700 employees. They started the wellness program. They have good incentive plan. The red line is the wellness program participants. The blue line is the non-participants during the time period in which we studied them. So the non-participants have a higher trend than the participants. We were able to separate them out. We look at them together, there's a difference there. In fact, when we look carefully at what that difference looks like, the gap between the two could be due to the wellness program. It could also be to some other factor we didn't measure. It could be to the fact that before the program even began, maybe the non-participants had higher claims. I know this, wellness program non-participants don't always have higher health risks, higher claims, or poor behaviors. Sometimes they're really healthy people and they just don't have time for the wellness program. In this particular study, the wellness program participants had elevated health risks higher than the non-participants. So maybe there's a difference in their BMI or other health risks, or maybe there's some other factor we didn't even measure. You never really fully know unless you do a randomized clinical trial, and we can't do a randomized clinical trial. But if I were to bet, just the fact that we were able to sort these two groups out and look carefully, we know that this individual company spent $1.4 million on their program over a 3-year period. They saved 4.8. That's an ROI of 3.3. And the best explanation for that difference is the effort they put into their wellness program. Now, this is one published paper we did 4 years ago, looking at a real answer to this problem. But then there's a lot of fiction out there, a lot of fiction. So I was asked, and colleagues were asked, to evaluate the claims of another worksite. This is a company that had been doing health coaching and just health coaching. And they got some data and they brought the data in and we took a really good look at it. And what we found was that it really didn't make any difference if they were getting health coaching or not. Plus, there was not very many people in the study, and the fewer the number of people, the harder it is to be confident in your findings. So we said, we looked at it, there's nothing here. There's no effect. Well, it didn't take much longer, but the individual who asked for this information went ahead and published a couple of articles, did some blogs, it showed up in Forbes, it showed up in Health Affairs, and they started to present these graphs. Look, here's what happened to total claims for program participants and non-participants. The yellow line was participants, the black line was non-participants. In 1 year period, the trend is totally different. Their claims were lower. Their inpatient hospital claims were lower, while the non-participants were going to the hospital a lot. And the outpatient claims were really high for non-participants. And then the emergency room visits were flat for participants, but really high for non-participants. So I see this data. It shows up on the web. It shows up in their marketing material. Having seen the original data set, I know for a fact that this is just a bunch of hogwash because I saw the data. There was nothing that could be published from the data because it found no difference whatsoever. And yet later, you can go ahead and spin this, make your marketing materials, you can promote this, and like every other industry, the wellness industry has its share of shady characters. Find me an industry that does not. Banking, lawyers, whatever, accountant firms, there's always some snake oil salesman, there's always some shady characters in every industry. It's the nature of humanity. The reason that this information is not viable, it was never been verified. We looked at it, it wasn't publishable, it never got published. So they then took it and spun it into something else. That's why the science would eliminate these kinds of results because there's no peer review, there's no oversight into what's going on. Well, how do you know the difference? How do you tell what's legitimate? It's not always easy, but if it's been verified, if it's been published, that's a pretty good indicator. It's at least pointing in the right direction. If it sounds too good to be true, you're probably right. Your gut tells you it's probably too good to be true, unless it's backed up with some good science. I said earlier, the science is large and compelling for wellness. It doesn't have a plethora of randomized clinical trials. But on the whole, there's some facts that we can learn from this data set. ROI studies are almost predominantly done on larger companies. And the reason is because larger companies give us enough statistical power to eliminate chance as being an explanation. So we have to use large groups. You can't do it with smaller groups. That's why all of the studies that have been published are published on larger groups. All of them, with a couple of exceptions, have been fully self-insured. In other words, they're taking care of their own claims and they save any money they don't spend. That's important. There's very few randomized clinical trials, and every one of these studies has weaknesses, as does every study ever published on anything on planet Earth.